Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, February 6th today, and I'm taking some questions from viewers and readers. I have a bunch of questions that have sort of piled up over the past few weeks, and occasionally I like to do a session where I basically just try to go through as many questions as I can in a Q&A session. It's also a good time to do it because it's not like there's nothing happening in the sky right now. There's always a lot to talk about, but there's nothing like immediately happening right now that I feel like I really want to talk about or write about. And whenever I get into little lulls like that, rather than forcing the issue, sometimes I find that it's helpful to just sit down and take some questions and talk about things that readers, listeners, viewers are curious to know more about. So I'm just gonna give you a preview of the different things that we're gonna go through today so that you can know whether or not it's worth your time to keep listening to it. So we're going to talk about retrogradation of planets. I've got a few different questions about retrogradations of planets. I have a question about the 6th house after last night's talk on the 12th house. I have, let's see, a question about Pluto Moon connections or Pluto Moon contacts. Those are all questions on the list tonight, and we'll see if I can get through more than that, but at least we'll be looking at those. So let's go ahead and start with questions about retrograde planets. So the Kendall, no, there is not class tonight. We have class next week with Nadia. So, but now you've got a class right here. So we're going to talk about retrogradation first. Alexandra writes, wanting to ask a question on interpreting retrograde planets in a natal chart. This is what she wrote. In practice, what I understand this to mean is that whatever it is that the planet does or signifies will either be less extroverted in the world and or that this planet's benefits have a way of showing up later on in life. So he's talking about two things. In a natal chart, you're looking at a retrograde planet. You're wondering, what does it mean? First of all, just a general piece of advice, I would not recommend paying a whole lot of attention to the retrogradation of Pluto, Neptune, or Uranus. The basic reason that I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to them is they are retrograde for very long periods of time. So I think what we're talking about has more to do with interpretation of traditional classical house rulers or traditional 7 planets if they're retrograde in your chart. If Saturn's retrograde, if Jupiter's retrograde, if Mars, Venus, or Mercury are retrograde, how do you interpret them? And what Alexandra is saying is that she has heard that they may signify the benefit coming later in life. If a planet promises some good, say it's Jupiter and Jupiter is retrograde in your 10th house, maybe that means that the good thing that's promised by Jupiter in the 10th house won't come until later in life. Well, there is something to that, so we'll talk about that. But the other piece that she's asking about has to do with introversion or extroversion. This is a more psychological interpretation of a retrograde, and it's distinctly modern. You'll have people saying, a Mercury retrograde would mean that you're more introverted, or a Venus retrograde might mean that there's some form of the planet being more introverted or something like that. Personally, I don't find that there's a lot of merit to this kind of claim. Maybe sometimes with Mercury retrograde, there are sort of abnormal or more things. I will agree that planets can be turned inward a little bit more with a retrograde, but even that I'm hesitant to give a lot of credence to that interpretation. So I'll tell you what ancient astrologers said about retrogradations, or what you can, what I believe is safe to say about what they signify. One of the main things to look at is that retrograde planets you have to think about what a retrograde planet is doing and what a planet is doing when it's not retrograde. So a planet that's not retrograde, that's moving in direct motion through the zodiac, is in a sense moving along in normal zodiacal order, one sign to the next, Aries to Taurus to Gemini, just like that, going around the wheel. That forward motion through the zodiac, in a sense, represents the volition of the planet. It's the planet's will. That's the planet's intentionality. Remember that planets in their motions through the sky, planets are correlated to all of us in our lives walking around with desires and intentions and motivations and a will and a sense of directionality, and also fears and aversions, things that we don't want. But the normal planetary flow through the zodiac is sort of broadly symbolizing the intentionality of the planets, the motivations of the planets, where they're heading, what they want or what they possibly don't want. And that all of that is correlated to our lives. So when a planet turns retrograde, what's happening is it's falling out of its normal zodiacal motion, sometimes called the secondary motion of the planets, and it is being swept up in the primary motion of the sky. So normally a planet moving in zodiacal motion will move from the west toward the east through the zodiac, which is moving in the exact opposite direction that planets are being brought through the sky by the primary motion. So in other words, every day, planets and stars rise in the east, they sort of culminate above, and then they set in the west along the zodiac. So when a planet turns retrograde and starts moving backward through the zodiac, it is naturally starting to go with the natural motion of the sky that moves from rising to culminating to setting, rising to culminating to setting. Whereas normally it would be cutting against the grain of that motion, in a sense, going in the opposite direction from west toward the east. So it's a very interesting thing because that duality of motion, it's simple. It's deceptively simple though, because it turns out that almost the entire astrological toolkit, the whole theoretical construct of astrology is based on very intricate ways of understanding the back and forth between these dual motions. Those dual motions, for example, are associated with the meanings of all of the houses. They're associated with the basic division of the sects and the sun and the moon, and the sun and the moon's associations with those two motions. For example, the primary motion of the sky that brings planets through the sky from rising to culminating to setting round and round in a 24-hour day, the ceaseless, constant, unifying, grand circular motion of the sky associated with the sun because it's more constant. And of course, that symbolism, both the sun and the primary motion, associated with that which is eternal, whereas the moon is related with the secondary motion of all of the planets. All of the planets have their own variegated qualities and characteristics. They all move at different speeds, and they all move against the grain of that primary motion. And the nature of their cycles is change, impermanence, and diversity. So the moon is related to those exact qualities, to constant change, to impermanence, to flux, to diversity, and in a sense, they're two contrary philosophical principles associated with the moon and the sun and the primary and secondary motion. So when a planet starts to fall backward into the primary motion, it's as though its volition, its will, which is associated with changes here in the material world, things that we try to go and do and get done and that we want or don't want or whatever, its will is becoming frustrated. That's one thing that retrogrades represent, is that the normal intentionality of the planet and its directness is being taken over by something bigger than itself. The primary motion is faster, and it represents the grand unifying hand of the creator, so to speak. And so a planet, though it has some degree of volition or agency or whatever, sort of symbolically speaking, it loses it when retrogradation happens. So a planet moving retrograde, to say that it's becoming introverted is to over-psychologize the meaning, when it's actually much broader meaning that has to do with the frustration of a planet's will, which is a symbolic representation of the will and intentionality of a huge myriad number of beings and autonomous players here on Earth, you could say. So the planet loses its will. The other thing, or its will is frustrated. So frustration, loss of control, the feeling like you've lost control, you're not in control anymore. other thing that can happen is that something that has been gained through direct motion, accumulation, as the planet goes through the zodiac, sign after sign, degree after degree, there's also a sense in which it's gaining something. I go and I act and do things in the world, and then I accumulate results. I accumulate the things that I go after. And then the planet turns retrograde, it starts moving backward through the zodiac. It is giving up what's been gained, and so retrogrades are associated with reversals of fortune. A reversal of fortune can mean a lot of different things, though. So a retrograde planet can be moving backward through the zodiac, and it can mean that you're giving back money that you earned. You're losing money somehow. It can mean a loss of status. It can mean a loss of certainty about something becoming uncertain, or something potentially becoming a breakdown, for example, in communication can occur. So what's been gained, whether it's clarity, coherence, agreement, or something very material like wealth or money or status, a retrograde can signify the loss of those things or a turn of fortune. Now, it doesn't have to be negative. For example, sometimes you accrue debt. And a reversal of debt might not be a bad thing. If a tumor is growing, a retrograde could very well indicate the shrinking of a tumor. So you have to think in a broad symbolic sense that retrogrades are very diverse. They can signify a whole range of things. I had a client not long ago, for example, who had retrograde Jupiter in relation to wealth inherited from the family. And I said, it looks like you may stand to inherit something from the family. Yes, indeed, she did. And I said, with a retrograde, it could be that there are reversals around it. Like maybe you don't get it, or it doesn't turn out as you want. And then I also said, however, it could also be that it's less than you anticipated, or that the other thing that can happen, of course, is as retrogrades are going along, when it comes to stationing, to turn retrograde, the planet slows down. When it's turning backward and starting to pick up speed again, it's still moving very slowly. Same thing happens when it stations to turn direct. It slows down. It takes a long time for it to sort of pick up speed again. But sometimes, depending on where the retrograde is at, it could also indicate delays, slowdowns. So I had said it also could be a slowdown because of the way it was positioned in her chart. And indeed, it turned out that her father, who has a sizable estate that will be passed on to her of some kind, had remarried, and that had eaten into what was going to be given to her, and also would delay it significantly because it wouldn't be given to her until the stepmother passed away. And because the stepmother was significantly younger, this would happen much later in life than was originally anticipated. So a very simple example. So I'm going to have some of my sparkling water here. So it was a very simple way of reading a retrograde. Oftentimes in modern astrological practice, we overemphasize the psychological. We think everything in the chart is psychological. Well, sometimes a retrograde planet is literally trying to tell you that there's going to be a delay in terms of getting an inheritance, or that there's going to be a snafu of some kind. So there's lots of instances of retrogrades meaning delays, frustration, loss of control, breakdowns of some kind of something that's been gained, breaking down and being reversed. So simple way of thinking about it: reversals of fortune, loss or frustration of control, stuff like that. So hopefully that makes sense for the retrograde question. And Alexander had also very intelligently pointed out that she noticed that maybe not every planet's retrograde is the same. For example, would a Saturn retrograde be somewhat more fitting for a planet that's already associated with decay or death or winter? And the answer is yes. Of course, a Saturn retrograde is categorically just different than a Mercury retrograde. But depending on what it signifies in your birth chart, you have to think about everything very contextually. When you're reading a retrograde, you don't just, the point of studying ancient astrology is to learn a variety of techniques so that based on the specific context of the chart, you have a sense of how to read the specific context of a retrograde. There's not ever just one size fits all answer to retrogrades. Most things in astrology are like that. All right. So thank you, Alexander, for that really great question. Now, there was another question about retrogrades, sort of, coming from Lisa. She wanted to know about Mercury being negatively impacted while under the beams of the sun. If so, how many degrees? What other factors are important to consider when considering Mercury's condition and which things take priority? This is a question about Mercury. It's another really great question. Short answer is, the short answer is that when Mercury is within 15 degrees of the sun, Mercury typically becomes invisible because its proximity to the sun makes it invisible. This is thought, generally speaking, to weaken any planet. When it's within 15 degrees of the sun, it becomes invisible. The loss of a planet's light is associated with, in some ways, with the loss of its autonomy, or the loss of its power, or the loss of its strength. The weaker a planet is under the beams of the sun, typically the closer it is to the sun, with a 15-degree range on either side, which is the equivalent of one whole sign, being taken as the sort of initial entry into the weakening place. Within 8 degrees, sometimes you'll hear the planets said to it becomes combust. First, maybe under the beams or under the rays, or you hear people say things like that within 15, and then combust within 8. And different astrologers may have slightly different ways of talking about this. I think it's accurate to say that once you get in within about 8 degrees, even down into like 5 degrees, the planet is in a process of dying. It's depending on what part of its phase, what phase it's in within a synodic cycle with the sun, it's a little different. But for example, when a swifter moving planet like Mercury is moving to conjoin with the sun because it's faster than the sun, and it's within those 8 degrees, it's in the very last stages of its life cycle. And the upcoming conjunction is likened unto old age. And the conjunction with the sun is then like a rebirth moment, death and a rebirth moment, at which point it then crosses in front of the sun and starts to emerge again into the evening sky as the evening star once it gets that nice 15-ish degrees of separation. So as it's emerging, it's also gaining strength, just like a little baby that comes out of the womb after 15 months can, maybe start to walk or something. So the planets, the thing that you want to think about with Mercury is, generally speaking, that Mercury is Mercury's slippery because Mercury is not visible a lot. A lot of the times Mercury is invisible. So Mercury has that feeling of being like part of the visible world, but part of the invisible world, which is also to say, in terms of the ancient distinctions philosophically and symbolically between the daylight world and the underworld, Mercury is both masculine and feminine. Mercury is both above and below. So Mercury has that changeability. So Mercury is kind of a unique planet in that regard. Typically, to get a strong Mercury, it's not sort of debilitated. You want to see Mercury either separating from the sun or more than 15 degrees separate from the sun on either side. That way, it's usually typically that's a sign that it would be visible. And a visible Mercury is typically going to be stronger than one that's weakening under the beams of the sun, heading toward a conjunction. But Mercury's sign position matters a lot. Being in Gemini or being in Virgo greatly, brings greater dignity to Mercury. It also, if Mercury is an evening star or a morning star and it's a daytime or a nighttime chart, sect considerations matter. If Mercury is moving pretty swiftly, if Mercury's luminosity and brightness is great, a lot of different factors to consider. It's also interesting to see Mercury cazimi sometimes, when Mercury is at the heart of the sun, meaning right within, the same exact degree of the sun, sometimes down to even like 15, 17 minutes of exact conjunction. That cazimi status can be actually greatly empowering for Mercury when it's like right at the heart of the sun, almost like the king giving you the seal, the official seal, as an ambassador in a foreign country. Like, you have the power of the king, even though you're not the king himself, or something like that. So Mercury sort of greatly enhanced when it's like right at the center of the sun. Now, of course, these are all quite technical details, right? So it again just goes to show that there, at least in classical astrology, there's a lot of things to consider. And the main thing that I would say with Mercury in a chart is just to see if it's under the beams of the sun and weakening, like if it's heading toward a conjunction with the sun and badly combust, if it's in a good or bad house, traditionally speaking, if it has good dignity by sign. Those are the main things that I look for. Trying to understand what Mercury's saying in the chart is more important, really, than trying to analyze or assess Mercury. It also helps to remember that all the planets are oracles. I mean, right? This is an oracular experience that we're having as readers, and almost better than trying to clinically analyze the chart is trying to use our analytical tools in order to hear what the planets are saying. Mercury's always saying something, and there is no good or bad Mercury. There's only trying to understand Mercury's context and situations so that you might hear what Mercury is saying. So thank you for that question. I hope that helps. Okay, so there was another question. Let's see. Where is it? Now I've got to find it. Somewhere. Noah was wondering if I could talk about Pluto Moon aspects. So Noah wants to know about Pluto and the Moon. I think that's another really good question. So we're going to talk about Pluto Moon transits, and then we can talk about some Pluto Moon aspects and natal work as well. If you were born with a Pluto Moon aspect, we can talk about that too. So let's talk about transits first. The moon in ancient astrology is the broadest symbol for the world of fortune and fate, the realm of materiality that we're born into, our position in it, our body, the stuff of our life, our family, the inborn characteristics that we're bound to that represent our lot in life. It's also intimately connected to temperament and mind, when any transit hits the moon, especially if it's a hard transit, meaning a square or an opposition, conjunction even, typically with those kinds of transits to the moon, what's happening is some of the deepest and most fated events of our life, the stuff that we don't have a lot of control over, the circumstances of life that we don't have a lot of say over, will blossom up in the sort of garden of our life. So the moon is kind of like for example, in my chart, the moon is in the 9th house, right? And I was born a preacher's kid grew up in the church. It's like not a lot of control over that in terms of like a conscious sense of like, can I control whether or not I grew up in like a religious family? Moon in the 9th house. So the moon is always telling us a lot about an area in our life by whatever house it's in, its condition in the chart, where we're sort of bound to things in the environment, in our life. They're sort of constants. It creates the atmosphere of life that sort of permeates us and everything. It's a part of our body. It's sort of you could tap into sort of the genetics and DNA, and that has that kind of feeling to it. And a transit to the moon in our chart will typically release some of the deeper and more inborn karmic conditions of our life, some of the broadest but also most deeply held karmic conditions of our life. It's just a simple way of thinking about it. Now, so when Pluto transits the moon by, let's say, a hard aspect, all of that I'm about to say would apply to a soft aspect like a sextile or a trine, but you would think of those aspects in terms of just probably being able to experience the dynamic between Pluto and the moon in a slightly more constructive or easy manner. But at any rate, so square, conjunction, opposition from Pluto to the moon, first and foremost, is going to just really bring up that inborn family, body, environmental karma. And it's just, it's so, one way of thinking about the moon is like, if your life is like a play on a stage, the plot line, the sort of narrative arc, is sort of like the sun. But the stage set, the environment, the conditions that the protagonist finds themselves in, the circumstances that surround the protagonist, and the stage set and the time and the place and that environment, that's the moon. So Pluto's, first of all, just going to bring that stuff up in a very powerful way. And usually by hard aspect, it's going to be more confrontational. It's going to be a confrontation with that deep karma. Then we also have to think about Pluto. What kind of trigger is Pluto? Well, Pluto is Lord of Hades, Lord of the underworld. So Pluto's, some keywords that really help for Pluto are depth, intensity. The word darkness is used. It has to be understood to be a diverse kind of darkness. Sometimes it's darkness as in depth. Sometimes it's darkness as in evil. Sometimes it's darkness as in the unknown or the mysterious. But that the depth, the intensity, the mystery, the drive, that sometimes the feeling of the demonic, these are all Plutonian forces. Of course, the effect that Pluto has is often to help one to release things that are pent up from a darker place, like a more unconscious place, we might say, in today's language. So a Pluto moon transit may bring up the deep, hidden, buried, gunk, basically, in the family or in the home or in your environment or in your body or in the recesses of the unconscious. And it brings it up through kind of volcanic eruptions. Stuff just has a way of just sort of erupting, and it comes out in sometimes revelatory fashion, meaning it's something seeing the light of day for the first time in a while. And that can be painful. It can be toxic. It can involve sort of purging, and obviously healing can be a part of the experience. So it has the power to be very transformative, but it's going to, it's really going to rake up the muck on the bottom of the well. You know what I mean? So, and it often also it brings up the things that we repress, the things that we try to push down, the things that we lock in the basement. Pluto has a way of either putting us in touch with those things that we fear or don't want to look at, that we try to excommunicate from our consciousness. It puts us in touch with them. And the encounter that we have with them can be healing. It can be very transformative in a positive way. It can be like, letting go of things and as we confront them. But obviously, the moon is it's sensitive for us because the moon is so much the bedrock of our lives. So the moon is so much of the kind of the regular everyday environmental conditions, a lot of which are unconscious, and it has a way of just you start seeing the steam coming up through the cracks of your life, and before you know it, stuff's just kind of coming up. It's often weirdly, it'll be associated synchronistically with things like, broken sewer pipes and like literal shit, like coming out of the pipes and into your basement. And I've heard the weirdest stories about like all sorts of sewage, filth, bats, just kind of dark underworld types of creatures or experiences sort of flooding a person's home or family, the dark family history that gets exposed. Relation to one's mother in particular with the moon can be, the dark mother, the all-consuming mother, the suffering mother that needs you and that kind of sucks your life force. It's a lot of dark mother stuff, but also, there's just as many times I'll see people going through experiences of deeper healing and growth with their parents, with their mother. I had Pluto Moon conjunction. I don't know, it was 2014. My parents were divorced. We bought a house. During the process of the sale of the house, the owner tried to take his own life. And then there was it was just a really dark and heavy period because my wife was also pregnant. And then we dealt with, well, I won't go into it because it's really dark, but we just dealt with some really weird stuff around the purchase of our home. And then my family was being divorced. We were, my parents were being divorced. My family was splitting apart. Then we were married. We had a kid and, got a house, and there was this whole crazy thing with the owner trying to take his life. And my grandfather died. The pipes in our house during the middle of this process, the pipes in our house broke, and there was basically like sewage coming out of the wall behind the refrigerator in our kitchen. And this led to a revelation for me about my diet that was really profound at the time. So, I mean, it was, it really just dug in and just, sort of roto-rooted stuff about my most basic elements of life: family, home, health, body, parents and mother. I mean, it just got in there. I also went through a period of time where I had profound anxiety attacks during that period, and trouble sleeping, which is also common for Pluto Moon. So the Pluto aspects to the moon, in particular, are a little bit more sensitive because the moon is a vulnerable place for all of us. It's kind of it's the place that it's familiar to us, even if it's hated. You know what I mean? So it's a weird thing how we grow up in an environment, and even if it's toxic, we say, well, this is home to me. Whether it's our bodies or whether it's our families or whatever. And there's things that are really wrong, really kind of messed up, but we go, well, that's what I'm used to. Pluto comes along and says, yeah, but you've got gangrene, and like, we gotta cut this thing off. There's a major, the trash needs to be taken out. Pluto Moon is also like that moment where you go down to your refrigerator and you open it up and you're ready to go and have some of that nasty thing that you eat that you shouldn't. It's bad for you, it is. And you open it, something smells awful. It's just awful. And you're like, what in the world? What is going on in my refrigerator? Well, that exact thing, let's say it's some kind of nasty dairy product or something, the expiration date was reached, and it's turned bad, and the whole smell of the refrigerator smells awful, and you're going like, oh my God, like now, because I've been so wired in obsessively to this pattern of consuming something that's bad for me, now I can't avoid it. I can't pretend any longer because it just let me know. It just like spoke to me and said, hey, that's not going to work anymore. Do you smell how filthy this is? And so it's a weird thing like that. You end up having to clean out your whole refrigerator. You've got to take everything out. You've got to scrub it down. You burn a little sage in there or something. You're like, my God, it's that moment where there is an expiration date that has been reached and something turns rotten. And Pluto with the moon, will just trigger that switch from neglecting something to not paying attention or avoiding something, denying something, suddenly it's turned rotten, and now the consequences are there, and it's dark. It's heavy, it's gross. Pluto Moon can be like that as well. So Noah, I hope that gives you some good things to think about with Pluto and the Moon. Certainly, there's a lot more that could be said. Books have been written about Pluto and the Moon. There's a good book I read a long time ago, Psychological Astrology. The Astrology of Fate by Liz Green about Pluto is very good. She does some good Pluto Moon stuff in there. But it was a book, I want to say it was called The Hades Moon or something like that. I don't remember who wrote it. Judith Hill? No, Judith something. But it was an interesting book about different archetypes associated with Pluto Moon. And I think it was called The Hades Moon. At any rate, lots that could be said about Pluto and the Moon, but hopefully that gives you some things to think about. The healing, of course, I should say that the healing potential for Pluto and the Moon is for the deeper sort of karmic structures of your life, those things that you're most intimately bound with. They can loosen up a little bit. Sometimes it's sort of reaping what's been sown, and it's just heavy. It's part of the deeper karma of your life that you just have to face. But sometimes there's also an opportunity to, start getting healthier, start addressing things that need to be addressed that Pluto pulls your attention to, and in that way can be very regenerative. All right, so that's from Noah. Really appreciate that question. Let's see. So the question from, I'm not sure who this is. There's no name on this one. This one's wondering if I use the mean or true node, and why. Yeah, so this answer is going to be just really, I'm sure, unsatisfactory. But so I use the mean node, and the answer is because I started using it long ago. One of my teachers used the mean node, and then I just started using it. And when I finally read and took time to understand the difference between the mean and true node, I failed to understand why one would be particularly better than another. So I can't, and I'm so stupid about the difference between the mean and the true node that I couldn't regurgitate that for you. But let me actually point you towards one thing that you could read that might be of interest to you. So my lame answer is I use the mean node because that's what one of my teachers used, and I've just always used it like that. Let me just give you a little article that you can read. So this is an article from Stephen Forrest, who's an evolutionary astrologer, that is called Mean Nodes versus True Nodes. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but I think that you may find it rewarding to take a look at it. So then you can see the difference for yourself. Stephen Forrest works with the mean node as well. And you can read his rationale, which will be much more intelligent than mine. So again, I am waiting to be more educated about any meaningful differences that could constitute a deeper level of choosing one over the other that I have maybe not yet found myself. But for whatever it's worth, I use the mean node. And there's the article from Stephen Forrest, Mean Nodes versus True Nodes, on forrestastrology.com. And I think his article is really nice. It'll help you understand the difference. But again, I can't regurgitate it for you. So thank you for that question. All right, let's see. Next. Okay, so there was a question from Betty about the difference between the 12th house and the 6th house. Last night in a video, I explained that the meaning of the 12th house and the astronomy that helps us understand the 12th house. It would be too complicated for me to try to explain the astronomy without a chart to use, and Facebook does not make it easy to share screens, unfortunately. So let me just say this. Her basic question, and this is a follow-up question from last night's talk, was, so if the 12th house is the house of bad spirit rather than bad fortune, which is the 6th house, does this indicate, as you said in the talk, that it's more possible to exercise our will in relation to matters represented there in the 12th house, whether through spiritual practice or otherwise, than is possible in relation to matters of the 6th? So basically, the 6th house is very similar to the 12th in that the 6th house represents things that sort of thwart us a little bit and tend to break the peace, or they have it has a way of signifying ongoing kind of chronic sufferings or drudgery or challenges. There's a lot of other things it represents, and the astronomy is very similar to that in the 12th that leads us to the topical designations of the house. So, but 6th house is called bad fortune and 12th is called bad spirit. So what's the distinction? And Betty wants to know if it has something to do with the will. Is the will more, because the will is related to spirit and fortune is more related to things that are sort of outside of our control, or the things that we're allotted in life. So she's asking if we have more control over the difficult things in the 12th house than we do in the 6th. This is a complicated answer. The will is really involved in both houses. The will is sometimes sort of led astray in the 12th house, where we take ourselves off course by sometimes making bad decisions. Sometimes it's also about influences that come into our life and try to throw us off center. Hence, it's called evil spirit, in which case having a spiritual practice does indeed help. 6th house has more to do with like a fender bender, right? It's not like a fender bender is different than like dealing with addiction. A fender bender in the 6th house, which is a house that's related to accidents, has something to do with you're driving and someone rear ends you. You know, there's nothing you really did to cause that necessarily, but it's one of the allotted misfortunes of your life. There's a certain amount that we all sort of have, good and bad. You don't really have control over the 6th house, no, because it has that more kind of accidental feeling to it. But you certainly have, spiritual life will help you respond or react to those events, and sometimes that brings things that are of greater benefit out of them. You know what I mean? Like if you get a fender bender and you have a meditation practice, the likelihood that you don't flip out, you know, is probably higher. In which case, there is something about the will that's always important. It's never that misfortunes or things that are sort of outside of your control it doesn't mean that your will isn't still vitally important to the interaction with fate. So, you know, when certain things come into your life and they throw you off track and they feel like you really didn't do anything to cause it, the will still matters a great deal in how you respond. The 12th house doesn't mean that you're fully in control of everything either. The negative influences that come and try to pull you off course, the things that try to thwart you in the 12th house, sometimes have they seem to be more intimately involved with your conscious will or your conscious loss of control, right? It is, in a sense, more connected to your choices and or your lack of healthy choices or something like that. There is that connotation. However, the 12th house, like any other house in the zodiac, all houses of the zodiac are houses of fate. There is not one house in the zodiac that does not have the implicit meaning of an area or dimension or zone of fatedness, right? All of the houses have the connotation, for example, of bearing something. Bearing something means it's something you're here to carry. It's something you're here to, you know, like if you bear children, or if you you have a cross to bear. Every house in ancient astrology was talked about as a region of fate. So it's not that the 12th house is an unfated place, whereas the 6th house is totally fated, like fender bender, or maybe you could drink too much alcohol, but you have control over that one. It's not like that. There is a general sense in which the 12th house has more to do with the influences that come in to your life and try to take you off course, that have a more spiritual feeling to it, meaning the demons you're fighting in your head. Do you know what I mean? but your will is still very important, and your spiritual practice is still very important for any area in the chart. The sixth house might be more of a fender bender in a sense, or it might be a chronic health condition that you're born with, something that feels less in your control. But also how you respond and work with it is of the utmost importance. So I know it's a little bit of a riddling response, but I hope that at least points you in the right direction. And maybe sometime I'll do another, if people have more questions about the sixth house, I can make a longer video about it. But that's a sixth house question. All right, let's see. What else do I have? Someone is asking about your horoscope, your monthly horoscope. How do you know which to choose between your sun or your rising sign? This is, to me, this is a really good question, and I'll try to give a decent answer to it. I always suggest the rising sign because your rising sign is, in terms of whole sign houses, your rising sign horoscope, the chart that the astrologer is using to make that monthly horoscope or that weekly horoscope or even that daily horoscope is based on the same exact configuration of houses and signs that your birth chart is based on. So if I'm using, for example, when I make my Cancer horoscope for the month ahead, I'm putting Cancer in the first house whole sign wise. And then, it goes around the wheel, around the wheel from there, then Leo, right? And then Virgo and so forth around the whole wheel. So as the planets during the month, like, oh, there's an eclipse in Cancer, or, oh, there's, Mercury's turning retrograde in Pisces, or whatever the case might be. The way that I make my interpretations is based on the whole sign houses that those planets are landing in while putting Cancer on the ascendant. So if Pisces turns retrograde next month in a Cancer rising horoscope, that's going to be the ninth house. So the interpretation has something to do with the ninth house. Well, the reason that tends to be the most accurate is because those are the exact same houses that the planets are transiting through in your birth chart if you're a Cancer rising. If you're a Cancer rising, then your ninth house is Pisces, right? If you're Cancer rising, then your 10th house is Aries. And if Mars is heading through Aries, about to make a conjunction with Uranus, and you use a Cancer rising horoscope, big event in the career house this month, right? On the 12th or 13th this month for all Cancer risings, there will be a Uranus-Mars conjunction. So that would be like maybe a shocking, sudden change of direction or some kind of intensity that's encountered in the workplace. That's because it's happening in the 10th whole sign house from Cancer. Well, again, if you're Cancer rising, your first house is Cancer and your 10th house is Aries in your natal chart. So that's why rising signs are recommended, because then your monthly horoscope chart is lined up with where the planets are traveling in your birth chart at the time. That's a really good reason to do it. Sun sign, of course, works as well. It's a little bit more, it's not as straightforward in that sense. It's not synced up. Your charts, you're going to be putting your sun sign on the ascendant of a monthly chart and then tracking the transits through that wheel oriented toward the sun sign on the ascendant, which does have validity. A lot of people swear by it. Maybe it's just a different way of turning the jewel, so to speak. I would recommend rising sign, compare to sun sign every month for 3 or 4 months in a row. See which one really speaks to you. A lot of the times people won't do that because they're not paying that much attention to their horoscope anyway when they should be. A horoscope gives you the most. It's not when you just read it, listen to it once and you go like, oh, well, it sounds like it's going to be a cool month. If you really want horoscopes to start speaking to you, you need to go back to them and track out the transits throughout the whole month. So like if you listen to my Cancer horoscope, for example, Cancer rising, you listen to it once, you get a general feel for it. Write down the dates that I highlight, right? And then come back on those dates and re-listen to the horoscope. That's when you're going to start putting the pieces together, and that's when monthly horoscopes are going to start clicking and giving you more valuable feedback and insight for your experiences. But a lot of times people take it in as entertainment for like 8 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, and that's it. And then they don't really get a lot out of it. And then they're like, well, I don't know which is more accurate, my sun or my rising. Well, yeah, because you don't pay attention. If you're not paying attention to it, why would you think that you could ever tell the difference? And it is like, it's personal too. Like, compare the two and really pay attention, and then usually you'll get really clear on it. So I had to get up a little bit of a soapbox about that one, because sometimes people ask that question, and I suspect that a lot of people aren't paying that much attention. And when you don't pay attention to astrology regularly, and then you expect it to speak like crystal clear, super accurate, just, hitting the bullseye, you're not putting in enough work. The oracle speaks to you, right? It's a living communication. It's a living transmission. The relation between the hearer and the speaker has to be cultivated in the heart and the mind through attentiveness, just like any relationship. If you cultivate that with your horoscope month by month, you'll get to feel the difference between what your sun and rising sign is telling you. For me, over time, it's just been like, well, the thing that speaks to me the most very clearly is my rising sign. So, okay, that's my spiel on that. All right, so that was a question for, that was a question about, I'm trying to remember who asked that question. Let's see. Don't know who asked that one. I can't find it anymore in the writings. Okay, so let's see. I think there's a couple more. Let's see if any of them are easy enough to. How do you judge the relationship between two planets that are close to each other but are in different signs? For example, Venus at around 29 of Gemini and the Sun at 3 of Cancer. Are they also considered conjunct? Well, in the case of Venus at 29 Gemini and the Sun at 3 Cancer, the Venus moves faster and is therefore going to conjoin the Sun, so it's considered an application. An application means that two planets are going to perfect an aspect. An aspect cannot perfect. It can't be exact unless the signs, the appropriate whole signs, are also engaged. Meaning, a conjunction can't happen out of sign. Technically, it just can't happen because they have to be at the same degree in the same place. A trine will always take place between two signs of the same element when it perfects. So if a planet is going to perfect an aspect, and it has not yet happened and it has to move across a sign boundary, we consider that an aspect. However, we consider it an aspect because it will perfect and will create the necessary whole sign connection. The thing that you have to take into consideration is, what does the sign change mean? Symbolically, a chart is not just static. The projected movements of planets in a birth chart, for example, a planet that's just about to change signs when you're born, symbolically that denotes a change in fortune that's going to happen in the life of the native. Where planets are heading, not not too far off, but in a more immediate sense, where planets are heading is not just an abstract symbol of some kind of psychological construct. It's also a living picture of something that's going to happen, something that's going to play out. Reading those details is much easier for people once they've started studying horary astrology. That's one way of quickly learning how to identify what planets are in a more immediate sense, and their actions and their context and what they're moving to do, how that will play out in a more predictive sense. That you learn that from horary. So if a planet like 29, Venus at 29 Gemini is going to cross into Cancer and then conjoin the Sun, first of all, that's a combust Venus, right? Second of all, it's about to change signs and become weaker because it's getting even closer to the Sun. So what does it signify if Gemini is in your second and Cancer is in your third, right? It could mean that your fortune around money is about to change as your father falls ill and costs you time and energy and money. You end up having to spend money on your father. I'm making this up because if you had Venus crossing signs from Gemini, whole sign Gemini in the second into Cancer in the third, the Sun in Cancer in the third would rule Leo, Sun in the fourth, the house of the father. So maybe it would be a symbol of, losing money due to father, because Venus, planet of good fortune, is going to exit the house of finances and be even more badly combust with the Sun and then conjoin the Sun, which is the ruler of the house of father. So that's a simple example. the point is that if a planet is going to change signs and it's going to perfect an aspect but hasn't, and a change of signs is in order, then that change of signs is a part of the interpretation of a predictive element in the chart that you have to pay attention to. Okay, but in a more generic sense, out of sign aspects should be considered if they're going to perfect. If they've already perfected and are separating and are out of signs, I really wouldn't consider it. The other thing is that, technically speaking, you don't really consider it an aspect if it's out of sign in traditional astrology, in the sense that the signs are the things that make the aspects. Sometimes in modern astrology, we think it's the opposite. We think it's planets that make aspects. But aspects are lines of sight between the signs. So within the circle, the 12 whole sign places see one another. And it's their lines of sight with each other, right, that establish the connections of the sides of the polygons, like the triangle. So Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces see one another. They have visual connection to one another within the circle by virtue of the triangle. So they see each other by means of the polygon of the triangle. That's what facilitates the lines of sight. The planets moving through those signs, first and foremost, connect with each other by whole sign. It doesn't matter if it's a degree-based aspect or not. If they're in the whole signs that see one another, then they have aspectual connection. They have lines of sight to one another, and they are bearing testimony to one another's topics in the life of the individual. But if the planets are also going to engage in a degree-based aspect within the signs, has a slightly different meaning. It sort of intensifies the relationship. It changes from a more general sense of testimony, for example, to the idea of one planet more closely scrutinizing another, bearing testimony more powerfully to another topic. So let's say you have the planet of a planet that's ruling your second house of money, and it's got a very close degree-based trine that is perfecting from Jupiter, right? That would be a more powerful testimony from Jupiter. But if Jupiter was in a whole sign trine, it was 20 degrees away and not perfecting, there would still be testimony from Jupiter to the topic of money. So the line of sight is first and foremost established by the signs. It's intensified by degree-based connections between the planets within them. And out of sign aspects perfecting are allowed as long as you take into consideration that the aspect between these two planets will come in time, but only after the planet's condition has changed in some symbolic shift from one house and topic to another, and perhaps a change of dignity as well. So another really technical question, but a very good one, and I hope that this helps. Okay, so, and I already talked about combustion, which same person wanted to know. Let's see. That one's too long, a little too complicated. Let's see here. This one is, here's a question, but I have to look. I don't know if this is going to work so well.
Hi everybody, this is Elenbaas.
I have to look at my YouTube page.
Your horoscopes for February 2019.
No, that's not going to work because it's playing my video when I try to do it. So someone left me a comment on the YouTube page, and in the future, you have to send me the full text of the question so that I can actually read it in my email, because otherwise it's too difficult to pull up if I have to go to YouTube. So let's see if there's any others. Someone is asking about, yeah, that's too complicated as well. I think that's it. Let me take a look and see. Yeah, that's it for now. Let's take a look and see if I've got any questions from any of you guys here. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. I'm happy to answer a few before we go here. Hello from Houston. Yay. Jill says, not sure why I have the sense that when retrograde is when you let go your will, a material interpretation to a higher purpose. Yeah, that's not bad either. Kind of a surrender of the will to something higher. I like that. Can you explain how to read progressions in relation to the natal chart? Oh boy, yeah, that's a big topic. I think that's a little bit too big for now. Email that one to me, please. Nightlightastrology@gmail.com. Someone asking questions about the progressed ascendant. You should email that one to me as well. I don't want progressions would be a big topic. I don't understand why you suggest Jupiter square Neptune as a positive aspect. I thought squares are always challenging. Very good question from Victoria. So the exception is transits from the benefics, right? There's really not a bad transit from a benefic. A square from a benefic, depending on what type of square it is like you could think of it like a well, it depends. Everything is very contextual. It depends on the house location of Jupiter. It depends on the dignity of Jupiter, etc. But aspects from Jupiter or Venus by square are usually not bad. You can't change the nature of the planet, right? So Jupiter and Venus bring blessings, generally speaking. So the aspects that you get from Jupiter and Venus are generally going to be positive. It is subjectively positive, meaning they tend to bring growth and they tend to bring confirmation and the green light or the thumbs up from the universe, so to speak. Jupiter, Neptune, it's never so simple as good or bad, though, right? It's every transit, especially mundane transits like Jupiter, Neptune, can indicate a wide variety of different things. So, yeah, but Jupiter, generally brings the greater benefic qualities. Okay. Could spiritual practices ever be associated with houses other than the ninth? Yeah, totally. In some ways, I think it's really important to recognize that spiritual practice is sort of transcendent to astrology. It's like there's nothing that can really, like the astrological chart is really meant to show you the ups and downs of the material fortune that you're born into, your karma. And it's not, there's loads of ways, you can understand yourself, your psychology. It's very helpful to look at these things. But probably different planets in different places of the chart can indicate something that's could be considered spiritual. For example, the seventh house. If you have Jupiter traveling through Sagittarius right now in your seventh house, the seventh house is traditionally a place where planets set and disappear and merge into the invisible. They become invisible. There's a sense in which the seventh house was traditionally associated with the worship of gods and with faith and with religion, because it's a planet that surrenders it's a place, the seventh house, that surrenders that which is given, as Manilius says. So the seventh house planet, whatever it receives, it surrenders and it sinks out of sight. So whatever it receives, it gives away. It sort of dissolves. The seventh house is called, by Manilius, said to be a place that was related to faith and constancy of heart. So in anything you join yourself to that's bigger than you, could be a spouse, it could be sex, it could be joining yourself to God or the gods. But the sense of immersing yourself in something other and bigger is part of the seventh house. It's a very spiritual house. Potentially Jupiter through the seventh can indicate serious changes in a life of faith. So meeting a teacher, becoming deeply immersed in a religious or spiritual practice. Jupiter through the seventh can indicate those kinds of things, as could Neptune or lots of other planets. So, and then there's lots of other examples like that throughout the chart where spirituality can become it can come into your life because of the experiences of really every single house. The fourth house was traditionally called the house of mysteries, for example. So there you have it. I think that's it. Progressions. Yeah, I don't want to go into progressions. It's just a kind of a bigger talk, but email me. on the bendings moon Aries and hit, but the upcoming Mars in Aries, which will be on bendings. Don't fully understand the question. Maybe you could clarify and email it to me. So anyway, that's what I've got for tonight. I hope this was interesting. I want to sneak preview something for you guys that I'm going to be doing. Should be making the first episode tonight. Maybe not recording it till tomorrow. I'm not sure. But I'm going to be going chapter by chapter through a wonderful little book called The Hermetica, The Lost Wisdom of the Pharaohs. This is basically a translation of many of the essential texts from the Corpus Hermeticum, which is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and that is also the mythical founder of astrology. So what I'm going to be doing in the weeks to come is going through this fine text, chapter by chapter, the excerpts that are from the Corpus Hermeticum, looking at Hermetic philosophy and trying to pluck out some of the main points from all the different passages attributed to Hermes, and showing how ancient people thought, how the Hermetic philosophers thought about astrology, and how that can help us in our understanding of astrology today. So I'm going to be making this episode by episode slowly, a talking tour of the Hermetica. So that should be fun. Stay tuned for that. All right. Thanks, everybody. I hope you guys have a great night. Take care. Bye.